Hey, and welcome. Over the past little while on this channel, I've been going back and playing console versions of Doom, but not just the official ones. I've been going out there to find the fan source ports that made it to consoles where Doom did not officially land. But one thing I didn't do in those various videos was compare and contrast and talk about how all these different source ports feel when you play them on actual hardware against each other. So I figured I would do that here. And we've started off here with the PlayStation 2 port of Doom, and you can see that other than the fact that the video is zoomed in, no idea why, it looks pretty great. Now, obviously, we would expect the PlayStation 2 to be able to run original Doom because by this time this was not too demanding on these consoles, but as you can see, the frame rate is pretty stable. The one thing I will say is that this probably has some of the worst controls out of all of these consoles ports that we're going to be looking at today. You will also have noticed that there isn't that much in the way of music. It seems that with some of these source ports, the choice was made to get the sounds of the game in rather than the music, which is a bit disappointing because obviously we love Doom music, but hey ho. I'm just going to let you enjoy the sounds of this version without me talking over them for a second. So let's dive into the second level here. What I am going to do now is I'm going to put some slight background music over while we kind of explore the rest of what PlayStation 2 Doom has to offer. But the main thing here is that it looks great. The textures actually look really, really nice in this version. And other than the controls in this version are pretty awful, I'm not going to lie to you. It's definitely a lot here. Like, as I said, we knew the PlayStation 2 was very capable of playing classic Doom, but seeing it running on actual hardware here, and yes, this is actually running on hardware from a PlayStation 2, it looks just so good, and it does make you wonder why this wasn't released in some form onto the PlayStation 2, because it probably would have sold pretty well. We're now going to dive into Doom 2 here. The thing with Doom 2 is that it didn't survive on as many consoles as the original Doom games, and the reason for that was because Doom 2 is a much more demanding game. There's bigger levels, lots more enemies, there's a lot more going on, and if you play Doom 2 on the PlayStation 1, the official retail version of Doom 2, you'll see that the PlayStation 1 does have a bit of a hard time handling some of the much larger Doom 2 levels, and those aren't even the biggest Doom 2 levels because a lot of those were cut out. We'll dive into Underhalls here, but you can see that performance is pretty great, and other than the controller issues that we discussed, it looks really great. Can you imagine if they'd released this with a 4-player local multiplayer? It would have been absolutely amazing back in the day. PlayStation 2 had some great first-person experiences, but I do believe that there was room for a classic compilation, maybe including all of the old Doom games. And I know what you're probably thinking now, well, what about the other classic Doom games? How do they run? Well, we're going to dive into No Rest for the Living, which is the expansion that was released originally with the Xbox 360 version of Doom 2. And you can see here that, again, it looks really great here running on the PlayStation 2. Now, obviously there's a lot more detail that goes into these kind of levels because in 2010 these were designed to be a bit more finesse, and obviously there's a bit more detail here. So seeing this running beautifully really does kind of showcase that PlayStation 2 was probably the sweet spot where classic Doom could have made a full retail release and been kept intact. Other than the hood being sort of out of frame, it's really not that bad, to be honest. So now we'll dive into Final Doom. Now, consider the fact that Final Doom was only officially released on PlayStation 1 as its own standalone release, and the fact that it ran pretty much terribly across the board. It's really cool to see this running on actual console hardware from the early 2000s, because it just showcases that even these bigger levels probably could have run a lot better. Now obviously if we played all the way through TNT, we'd probably hit some of the much larger levels, and that probably would be a bit more of a test for the PlayStation 2 hardware. And I'm very tempted to do full playthroughs of this in the future, because I do think seeing some of those bigger levels would be really interesting. Remember, the only way you could play classic Doom on the PlayStation 2 generation of consoles was through the official Xbox release of Doom 3 Collector's Edition, or through Resurrection of Evil, the expansion pack for Doom 3, which classic Doom was bundled in as sort of like an extra. That port's okay, but I would argue that this is actually better, if we're being completely honest. It's definitely really cool to see Final Doom running on console like this. And if you're wondering about TNT, then of course we can also go and look at Plutonia here. And Plutonia itself, you know, runs fine, looks great. Obviously, if we played through to some of the bigger levels, we'd have to have a look at the performance there, but there's nothing here to really indicate that, you know, things are looking rough. As you can see, even when all the bony boys here come running out onto the screen, it's not any trouble at all. You can also use the PlayStation 2 to play custom WADs, and as you can see here, I've thrown Nuts in just to kind of pressure test that enemy limit. Of course, this is a ridiculous extreme to take things, but I think it's really novel to see Nuts, probably the most infamous of all Doom WADs, running on PlayStation 2. And of course, as soon as I shoot, the enemies down below start flickering in and out of existence, and of course, you know, the frame rate has completely collapsed here. Nothing unexpected, but it is fun and quirky to see custom WADs running on PlayStation 2, and it does really kind of showcase the potential that was left on the table during this time, because I do think a PlayStation 2 version of Classics Collection would have gone down an absolute treat. But of course, we're not just looking at PlayStation 2 today, we are looking at the Gamecube here. Yes, this is running on actual Gamecube hardware, and as you can see, we are fully in frame here. So an interesting fact about this project is that this was considered lost media for the longest time. When I was hunting down the files to put this footage together, it took a long time for me to find the files and to get them into a working order, because even now it's quite difficult to find them. They were only recovered a few years ago. So Doom on GameCube was actually lost media for the longest time, and it was quite a challenge finding all of these files, bringing them all together, because there's a lot of hearsay, there's a lot of, oh, these files are in this zip file. It was quite a challenge to get all this together, so I'm quite glad that I was able to make this happen. But for me, seeing it run on GameCube is pretty incredible, because obviously Doom on any Nintendo console always feels a bit wrong, but seeing it run like this is pretty cool. You'll notice that there isn't any music again, and again, I suspect that's because of the technical limitations. They didn't have time to refine the experience. It should be noted that this port is quite basic. It doesn't allow you to do any customization of controls, it doesn't allow you to use any cheats. It's very bare bones, but obviously because this project has not been touched for well over a decade, it's not really that surprising. Just seeing it run really stably on a GameCube console is just great in itself. And the reason I'm playing all these same levels is so you can kind of get an idea for what the game runs like. I'm gonna let you just enjoy the ambience for a moment here. So unfortunately, there is a bit of a fatal problem with this version of Doom, and that is that the sounds actually desync after you've been playing for about 10-15 minutes. So you can see here that when I'm shooting my gun, the sounds are completely desynced from what's going on. Now I couldn't figure out what caused this. I don't think this is anything I've done because it runs fine otherwise. I think this is just a case of it's a sign of how early days this project actually was, that it wasn't refined. And it's a bit of a shame because it does mean that if you want to play through this on GameCube to the final level, you're gonna have to put up with this as an issue. Luckily, we can get some of the demo footage here to kind of get a peek at how the further levels run. And again, much like with the PS2, it would have been really cool to see a port of classic Doom being brought over to GameCube, because the GameCube had 4 control slots. I think it would have been really fun to have co-op deathmatch locally. It's something I think that the GameCube would have benefited from, although let's be honest, no one was really releasing GameCube games towards that console's end. If you want to give this a try yourself, obviously you're going to need a homebrew enabled GameCube, you're going to need an SD card, and I'll put the files down in the description. If anyone ever does a full-on GameCube port, I will be all over that, let me tell you. But for now, we're going to step back a generation and take a look at 64 Doom. This is Doom running on Nintendo 64, and considering the fact that we've gone back a generation, other than the fact that, you know, the image is a tiny bit softer, it looks pretty great in my opinion. You'll also notice that we have music back, which is great because I feel that the music in Doom really adds a lot to the atmosphere. Because, let's be honest, music in these Doom games is pretty awesome, even if it's a little bit weird in this version. In fact, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to let you enjoy the ambience of this for a little bit. So control-wise, this version is actually not too bad. You can make use of the D-pad, or you can make use of the thumb stick on the Nintendo 64 controller. Of course, the Nintendo 64 controller is a beast all to itself, so choosing which one you want to use is pretty much down to you. I will say the thumbstick is a tiny bit too sensitive for my liking. I wasn't able to tweak it down, unfortunately, which means that I end up using the D-pad here. We're going to take a dive into Thy Flesh Consumed here. Now, Thy Flesh Consumed didn't make regular appearances on the consoles in the 1990s, and you can see here that it's handling it pretty great, and it really does raise the spectre of classic Doom. Really probably would have done insanely well on Nintendo 64 had they ported this over. Whether it be this version or the PlayStation 1 version, I do believe that what you're seeing here is a very refined version of classic Doom, and it probably would have been the best version in the 90s on consoles, hands down, no question. And like I said with the other consoles, imagine if in the age of GoldenEye and other multiplayer games on Nintendo 64, they'd allowed you to have split-screen multiplayer on your Nintendo 64. That would have been pretty cool as well. I do think though this might be my favourite version of classic Doom from all these versions that we're playing here, because we're going to dive into Doom 2 here, and it still chews through this like a champion. Now, of course, we're not seeing the bigger levels here, but I am going to let the demo run through a little bit here, because obviously Orb Destruction here is a slightly bigger level. There's a lot of sectors that the player's seeing, because obviously there's a lot of things going on, a lot of enemies, and it's handling it really well. Like, there's a tiny bit of slowdown at points, you can kind of see it, but of course, compared to what gamers were getting on PlayStation 1, it's night and day, let's be honest. And this is me playing through the Gauntlet level 3 of Doom 2. It should be pointed out that there are actually two versions of 64 Doom, one from the 2010s and one that's a bit more recent from the 2020s. Now the more recent one gets rid of those bars that you can see in front of ThatNukemGuy here. Unfortunately, if you want that version, you've got to recompile it yourself, and things get very, very technical, and unfortunately, I have not been able to do that myself yet. But if you want to do it, it's very much out there in Google land, so just Google away and you'll be able to do this yourself if you have a Nintendo 64 and a EverDrive. We'll take a look at some of the later levels from TNT here, and even though I'm not playing this, you get an idea for just what these levels are like to experience as you're wandering around, and it's such a shame to me that this was not considered for a release, because obviously Doom 64 runs insanely well on Nintendo 64, but this just confirms that these bigger levels from the PC version would have also been handled really, really well on Nintendo 64. And of course, if we're looking at TNT, we've got to go and dive into Plutonia. At some point on the channel, I'm very likely to do a full run through of this version of Doom. I'll probably make sure to grab the newer version before I do that, just because obviously the bars aren't too distracting, but they can be a bit of a visual sort of reminder that you are playing something that isn't quite a refined product here. But again, even at this stage, you can see it just runs really, really well, and it's really, really easy to control. Once you kind of get used to the fact that you're probably not going to be using the control stick, fighting enemies is pretty fun. And this, of course, if you play Final Doom on the PlayStation 1, is actually the final level of that version of the game. So it's pretty apt that this is where I'm going to be stopping the showcase for the Nintendo 64 version of Doom here. You'll notice that when the demo is moving around and as the player gets closer to the Caco demons, things get a bit more jittery, like the frame rate isn't perfectly stable in this version, but of course with a bit of refinement and maybe, bringing in some of those PlayStation versions of these levels with reduced enemy counts, that could have been sorted easily. But now I'm going to dive into the PlayStation Portable version of Doom. So the thing I'm going to point out here is that this is by far the most customizable version of Doom that I've played so far. Not only can you play custom WADs through this, but you can also do what I used to do back in the DOS days and mix and match your WADs. So you can bring texture packs in and you can sort of have a fun time doing that, and I'll show that off in a little bit. But playing on the PSP here, it's actually very responsive and it's really good, to be honest. The thing with the PlayStation Portable is you don't quite know what to expect from it, because obviously it was a very capable handheld machine, but you never quite know what you're going to get when you put homebrew games onto it in terms of performance. And clearly here, Doom is showing that yes, it probably would have run really, really well. I remember when Doom came out on the Game Boy Advance, it was kind of heralded as a big deal. Kind of makes you wonder if the idea of putting this onto the PSP would have ever been a really viable option. But what I'll do here, I'm going to stop and I'm just going to let you listen to the ambience for a bit. Once again, Doom running really, really well on the PlayStation Portable here. So let's dive into Doom 2 here. A comment that sometimes pops up in my videos when I cover this kind of thing is, what's the point of this? Why are you giving this any attention? It's not that impressive. And I can always tell that that's by someone who was not around during this time, because let me tell you, Back when the PlayStation Portable was around, the only way you could play Doom on the go was the Game Boy Advance versions of Doom, and I love those versions of Doom, don't get me wrong, but they had their own issues, they had levels cut out, it was not the full Doom and Doom 2 experience, and this kind of showcases that even in the span of just a few years, hardware had reached the point where games like Doom, which were groundbreaking when they released in 1993, could run flawlessly on even portable consoles. And during this time, I really wanted there to be a portable version of Doom that had everything it included, all the levels, all the graphics, with none of the performance sacrifice. And we didn't get that until much, much, much later on. And it really just showcases that had it had the desire to make it happen, PSP really probably could have been a destination for classic Doom fans to gather around. But I am going to let you listen to the music in this version because it is quite something. I'm of course going to show off the fact that the Archvile is indeed here, and it is an enemy that will try to kill you if you give it a chance. Remember that that was not in the PS1 or N64 versions of Doom. Well, Doom 64, but it never made the cut for that one. So yes, the PSP could run the retail classic Doom games had id Software had the desire or appetite to release the game onto those consoles. And if you're curious about how the custom WADs run on here, then let me show you Memento Mori 2. This is actually one of the WADs that I grew up playing a lot, so I'm very familiar with this one. And again, seeing this run on a handheld console from the mid 2000s is never going to not impress me. And the fact that it's running it so flawlessly. The music's a bit weird, the sounds are a bit wonky on this version, but again, the basis is here, and had id Software had the appetite, this was a more than feasible conversion job if they'd really wanted to make it happen. And finally, let's mix and match some WADs here. Here I'm using Dystopia Freeze texture pack alongside Nuts, just to kind of showcase that yes, you can mix and match to your heart's content here. This is probably the most interesting way to experience Doom from this era on consoles that it was never officially released onto. Of course, the second that I run in front of these enemies, it's all going to come crashing down. Yes, we expected this. It was just to kind of compile all these different versions of Doom that have been brought to consoles by fans. Let me know which version here impressed you the most. Are there any other versions that you're aware of that you'd like to see me maybe play on the channel? Let me know in the comments, and thank you so much for watching.